Sounds great. Right. Thanks, Jill. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our first webinar in the Cocktails and Conservation series. I hope a few of you made the drink because it's super delicious. So my name is Sydney Lyons. I work for the Gallatin Conservation District. Myself and Jillian Rowe have been putting this together in kind of ties with Earth Month and Earth Day. So there's 2 more webinars after this, but we're linking it back to Earth Month and Earth Day being this week. So if you live in the Gallatin Valley and you're not yet familiar with everything happening, you should check out gallatinvalleyearthday.org. There's a bunch of events happening and we'd love to see you there. So tonight's speaker is Mace Vaughn. He works for the Xeris Society and is going to inform us a little bit more about pollinators. So I hope you're enjoying your drink if you made one, but sit back, relax, and I will pass it over to Mace. Thanks.
All right, sounds good. Excellent. All right, well, hi everybody. Yeah, so I ponied up, so here's mine. It's even got a little bit of honey in the bottom just to, you know, keep it real. So thanks Jillian, thanks Sydney for the invitation to come on out. As Jillian just put in the chat box, please, as we're going along here, feel free to put in some questions there. And in fact, I mean, since we've got a relatively small group here, if you want to put in the chat a couple of things that you're, you know, when you think about pollinators, when you think about pollinator conservation, maybe questions that you've even got coming into this talk, since we are kind of hanging out here and it's just after dinner or at dinner time. Yeah, put some, I want it to be as interactive as a Zoom meeting can be, or webinar presentation. So please feel free to just put some things in the chat, like stuff you're interested in. We may not be able to get to all of it, but I'll certainly get to like some of the specifics. But if there's some things that, you know, I might be able to follow up on or have somebody follow up on, might be able to do that. So yeah, please look for that. Please look for that chat, and yeah, please feel free to put that in. And as I go along, if you've got questions that come up, I may be able to tackle them in real time if they're quick. Otherwise, we will have time at the end for some back and forth Q&A. So tonight we're going to talk about supporting that miniature wildlife in the garden or on the farm and taking that pollinator habitat to another level. Just want to thank Sydney and Jillian again for the invitation. And also, you know, the funding for my position, I should go back. I am the Pollinator and Agricultural Biodiversity Program Co-Director at the Xeris Society for Invertebrate Conservation. So in this position, I oversee a team of about 25, soon to be 26 staff based all across the country that are working on supporting conservation of pollinators, mostly in agricultural landscapes, but we've taken our resources and really tried to, in many places, in many ways, as I'll talk about later on, help them become as available as possible for people even, you know, working on home gardens, parks, you know, roadsides, you know, a whole range of different landscapes. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I also serve as the conservation entomologist and a partner biologist for the Natural Resources Conservation Service out of the Western National Technology Support Center in Portland. And I have 16 of those 25 staff are partner biologists like me, working out of NRCS offices, hand in hand with the NRCS, providing training, you know, conservation planning support, just helping with the design and creation of habitat. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. I mean, one thing I'm pretty proud of is that, yeah, the program I manage is the world's largest pollinator conservation program. So it's pretty awesome. Like, I feel, like, I admit, I mean, and it's because of the amazing people that we have working for us. Like, we just have, yeah, a great team that just seems to be steadily growing. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, so that's a little bit about me. This is who you got to listen to for the next 45 minutes. So we'll have a good time. So thanks again, yeah, to Jillian and Sydney. Thanks to NRCS for helping to fund, you know, my time and this time putting this presentation together. Xeris, just for those of you, actually, how many of, well, hard to tell. There's no like hand raising thing with this, is there? No, not really. Okay. Anyway, like for those of you who don't know Xerces, we have been around for 50 years. This year was our 50th anniversary. We focus on the conservation of invertebrates and on the conservation of invertebrate habitats. Like I said, I'm based in Portland, Oregon, where our main office is, but we've got regional offices just all across the country, from Maine to Washington to California. So, you know, I focus on our pollinator and agricultural biodiversity work, but we've got programs working on dragonflies and actually all fireflies and mussels. Actually, I'll get a little more into that in a bit. So this is a 3-year-old picture. You can now almost double this staff, and that's who you've got now supporting this work across the country. So it's not just my program, but work on endangered species and freshwater mussels and fireflies, pesticide risk reduction, outreach. We've got a new program called X Kids that just came out. Like, we just have a lot of really, I think, fun, interesting, innovative work going on, all focused on invertebrate insect conservation, mostly in the US, but some in Canada and some worldwide as well. The heart of what we do as an organization is to take all the science that's out there on the conservation of invertebrates and turn it into hundreds of publications geared towards different landscapes, different audiences, different invertebrates, to try to make invertebrate, insect, freshwater mussel, you name it, conservation something, you know, everybody can take a part in and be a part of. And so going to our website, you can, you know, kind of get access to all of these publications. A lot of what we do is outreach and education. So just looking at the last maybe 12, 14, 15 years, you know, we've reached out to 175,000 people in trainings all across the country and some outside of the country. We also, through this work, have supported more than 1.6 million acres of pollinator habitat, not to mention protecting and restoring tens of thousands of acres for rare and at-risk invertebrates. So that 1.6 million, that's just on private land. That's just working lands and gardens across the country. But we also work on federal lands to help, you know, manage habitat for the Martin skipper butterfly or the western bumblebee. This is all part of what we do nationwide. Okay, so that's just a little bit about who I am, kind of the organization that I work for. But tonight, we are going to talk about pollinators with a focus on native bees, because a lot of people don't know native bees, you know, as well as other pollinators. And they're certainly our most important. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the importance of pollinators, the importance of invertebrates, talk a little bit about the diversity and habitat needs of bees in particular. I'm thinking, like I said, almost totally about native bees here. Not that honeybees aren't awesome, but like, I want to look at this broader diversity, talk some about pollinator conservation basics, but then also how do we kind of go increasingly, what I've gotten excited about talking about is how do we go that kind of extra step or that extra mile to really move things along. Yeah, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. That's the vision. We'll see where we go. So like I said, as we go forward, put questions in the chat. And I see, Emily, you were noticing here fewer bees in the garden in Bozeman last year, and what are thinking about was one of some of those drivers of year-to-year variation. Yeah, we'll go through and kind of talk about kind of what drives pollinator populations generally, and then at the end we can circle around to your question. So we'll hit on that. All right, let's dig in. First thing, importance of pollinators. Like, why do we even care? So it's important to know, I think, that more than 85% of flowering plants need an animal, and these are mostly insects, to move pollen from one flower to the other in order to, you know, reproduce, to set seeds, to produce fruit, and all that. So these are fundamentally, pollinators are ecological keystones when it comes to, you know, to our natural habitats. And when we look at human nutrition, we sort of put the attention on us, you know, 35% of crop production worldwide either is completely or somewhat dependent on bees and other pollinators in order to be productive. In the US, if we look back, actually, I should update these based on inflation. On 2012 dollars, $18 to $27 billion worth of crops in the US are somewhat dependent on, are either totally or somewhat dependent on pollinators for production. And this is more than $200 billion worldwide. these crops, this is our fruits and our vegetables. I mean, these are where we get our minerals and vitamins. So this is where we get the bulk of our nutrition. And when we look at sort of our overall diet, and when we think about not just fruits and vegetables, but when we think about all the products that come from livestock that are fed on alfalfa, so milk, dairy, meat. When we look at oils, sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil, when we look at all these different products that are out there that we eat, scientists have estimated that roughly 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food and drink we consume ultimately traces its way back to a pollinator. And I think when you start looking at all those food groups, I begin to wonder if 1 in 3 is in fact maybe an underestimate of kind of the importance of having pollinators functioning and delivering that service. So one thing we did, oh my goodness, this is now a long time ago, back I want to say in 2008, 2010, we did a fun little experiment with Whole Foods markets in Rhode Island, and in the middle of the night took a picture, from a ladder of their produce department at 11:30 at night, and then rushed around and took all the produce out of it that the proportion of which is pollinator dependent. And we had some fake shoppers just to make it look real, and then went back with the fake shopper and just give you a sense of this is the amount of produce in the in the produce department that is dependent upon pollinators, going from this to that. So saying goodbye to your berries and your avocados and to a lot of your onion production and all these different things that at some point needed a pollinator, either produce the seed that you would plant to grow the onion, or actually the pollination itself to get the the apples, for example, that you need there in the front. Anyway, so when it comes to food, pollinators are important. When it comes to food and habitat for wildlife, they're also important. So those same kinds of fruits and seeds that we might eat or use in farming, they're also, of course, with native plants, a major part of the diet of all sorts of birds and mammals. Invertebrates and pollinators themselves are food for wildlife, including, as an example, almost 90% of birds need insects during at least one life stage. So when we build habitat that's insect rich, insect abundant, we're really feeding all the songbirds that soon enough, if they're not already, will be flying through your backyards. Right now, the warblers are hitting things around here pretty hard as they're moving north. And when we create high quality pollinator habitat, whether it's in our backyard, the back 40 of a farm, or on our rangelands, we're really creating habitat that's got high plant diversity, high structural diversity, wildflowers, shrubs, trees, connectivity in the landscape that's really not just good for pollinators, but just good for all sorts, meeting the needs of all sorts of other wildlife. So when we think about pollinators and other invertebrates, it's important to know that not only are they important, but they are experiencing these sort of alarming and rapid declines. So analysis that we've done with researchers across the US and in Europe, but looking at just the US data, shows that at least 28% of bumblebee species are threatened with extinction. We've got species like the rusty patch bumblebee here, also the Franklin's bumblebee in Oregon that are listed on the Endangered Species Act. Over 17% of North American butterflies are at risk of extinction. And if we take one even common species, and this is a trend among many common species, even once common species like the monarch butterfly have declined by as much as 90% in the east, by as much as 98% in the west over the last 20, 30 years. And that the decline is not as extreme in many other common butterflies, but we see that in pretty much everything when it comes to butterflies across the country. Even those cabbage whites, those little introduced weedy, kind of noxious, like kind of pretty, but invasive butterflies from Europe from back in the day. Even in many places, cabbage whites, we see their numbers declining as well. So yeah, there's definitely a conservation situation out there. There's definitely room for concern and room for action. So what I want to do when I think about and help people think about pollinator conservation, as I'll talk about in a moment, bees are really the heart of that. And one of the things that I think is most fun to share in thinking about and getting people excited about, frankly, springtime and going out in the garden, is to get sort of an overview on the variety of native bees that you all will see, there up in Montana, and how to think about them from an ecological or habitat perspective. Because as you can imagine, there are, as let's see here, actually, I'll come to it. I'm getting ahead of myself. So when we think about pollinators, there are all sorts of groups of pollinators, right? You've got butterflies, you've got flies, you've got moths, you've got wasps and beetles. These are all some of the most common groups that are out there, but it's bees that are most important. And so therefore, thinking about the service that's provided, I tend to anchor these talks around our bees and hopefully open people's eyes to the variety that's out there. So they're most important because they do three things. First of all, they actually collect and transport pollen. So that's pretty unique. Wasps, butterflies, moths, beetles, they visit flowers, but they're not actually collecting pollen. And by collecting pollen, bees are moving a lot of pollen around between flowers. Second, they forage in the area around a nest. So if we can create a landscape where they are nesting, then we are also creating a landscape where they're going to be there potentially to find those flowers and come to your garden, come to your farm, or just be present in the landscape. And last, they exhibit this cool behavior called flower constancy, where bees actually learn how to work a flower, how to collect the pollen or the nectar from a rose or from spirea or, I don't know, from a goldenrod. And then once they've learned that and they know it's there, they're going to keep visiting that same flower over and over again, which, as you can imagine, means the pollen is going to the right flower, time after time after time, therefore making pollination more successful. So when we think of bees, we typically, everyone sort of thinks of yellow and black striped. They often then, of course, confuse them with wasps, which are definitely not bees. I mean, wasps are basically carnivorous bees. So wasps like to gather, they're out there collecting meat. They'll visit flowers, don't get me wrong, but that's just to get the nectar to fuel the adults. But they're actually out there, instead of collecting pollen like bees to feed to their young, wasps are collecting meat, whether it's caterpillars or aphids or a little bit of turkey from Subway. They're carnivores looking for meat to take back to a nest. It makes them very different. And honeybees are also pretty different and pretty weird if we start comparing them to the 3,600 other species of bees in the US. So the European honeybee, by having that hive, by having a queen that technically, a hive that persists with tens of thousands of workers, year after year after year, that is completely different from pretty much everything else out there. Like none of our native bees, for example, will, allow you to have, allow you to, put on a bee beard or anything kind of funky like that. So when we look at our diversity, we're looking at 3,600 species right now in the United States. And I'm actually, instead of diving into the variety that's out there, I'm going to go right to the meat of it, which is that when we think about bees, when we think about your backyard or your farm, all you really need to know is that there are three types. There are basically three groups of native bees that are out there. And I'm going to show you some pictures and give you a sense of the variety. And I'm going to go through each of these lifestyles. But if you can understand the lifestyle of a ground nesting solitary bee, a tunnel nesting solitary bee, and a bumblebee, that goes a long way towards just understanding how to think about where there might be habitat in and around your garden or your farm. So let's start we're going to start with the life cycle of a solitary bee. So unlike that honeybee, most of our native bees are solitary. That means you've got an individual female that'll come out, mate with the male, but she's going to then do all of the work of building a nest and provisioning a small nest by herself. So let's say she comes out, this is a mining bee from California. She's come out in the springtime, right about now, when the vernal pools are drying out in California. She mates and then basically goes out and starts collecting pollen and nectar to then build her nest. And so she's a ground nesting solitary bee. So she's going to dig a hole underground, line it with a waxy secretion, put this ball of pollen and nectar there, put an egg on it. That basically then close up that cell underground and do this again and again and again, just digging these holes underground. And then that egg is going to hatch into this larva, feed on that pollen and nectar, eventually pupate. And then for most species at the same time period the next year, in this case in the early spring, come out and do this all over again. And as you'll see, some bees come out early spring, some late spring, some in the summer. There's quite a variety in the timing of when different bees come out. So if we look at our ground nesting solitary bees, this is roughly 70% of those 3,600 bees. From the surface, they might look like ant nests or sort of wormholes. I'll tell you how they're a little bit different here in a second. They can be found in turf, but more often in kind of bare, exposed ground, especially if it's on a south-facing slope. They really like kind of sandy to loamy soils overall because those tend to be drier, more well-drained. But it doesn't mean they're not going to be nesting in clay. But it's that south-facing, warmer, dry slope or warmer, dry areas where it's a lot easier to see them. So I sort of recommend as you're walking around, look for there where you've got south-facing slopes with maybe sparse grass. Particularly in the spring, early summer, we might see holes. I'm going to show you some pictures here. One thing that I think is really cool is each species has a different architecture of nest underground. And this is just a couple of examples. Sometimes they're rooted, sometimes they just stack a few of these cells up next to each other. Sometimes they have a single tunnel down the middle and then they just corkscrew around it to have these like little cells. I mean, it's just amazing, like to think about what is happening literally actually in my case in my front yard, as we'll talk about in a moment. That you can't see. It's almost like fish in the ocean, where there's all this life that's happening in a place that you can't see, where you kind of wish you could take the soil away or the water away and just see where all the fish were, or in this case, all these bees underground. So just to give you a sense of what it looks like, a lot of people have taken pictures, like have dug these out to see what they look like. Here you can see the tunnel coming down to these cells underground. Here's a little ground nesting bee poking her eye out, poking her head out of the hole, sticking her eyes out. They can be several centimeters to a meter or more deep. I mentioned the lining. And as we're looking around for them, they can be under rocks, they can be in yards, they can be little piles of dirt here that are kind of being pushed out by this ground nesting bee. I think one thing to look at is how dry, particularly when they're being excavated, worms tend to have castings that are kind of held together or clumpy. And a lot of our bee holes, it's going to be, they're just throwing dirt out, and you can imagine, or kind of digging it out and pulling it out, as you can see here. So as spring starts in those warm, dry areas, start to look for where there are these holes that maybe show up kind of out of nowhere. So just to give you a sense of the variety that's out there, I'm going to walk through just some of the, what you might see if you're at your flowers or, see these bees coming out of the ground. And I'm going to start off small and get bigger. We've got these tiny little sweat bees that are out there. These are, the genus is Lasioglossum. That's not relevant. The main thing is that they're tiny little black things that look like hardly nothing. It looks like a fly. They tend to be active in the summer. They nest in the ground. They can be pretty abundant in some cases. And actually, you look at them up close, they're pretty cute. You can have some slightly bigger sweat bees that have got nice stripes on them. Again, these tend to be groups of bees, the halictids, that come out more in the summertime. We start to get to some of my more favorite ones where we see these beautiful iridescent green sweat bees. These again are just a little bit bigger, probably half an inch, a little more. And they again are more summer active, nesting in the ground. And sometimes they can have these striped abdomens on them. Not unusual to see these, especially from starting, say, midsummer through the end of the summer. They can be pretty abundant, particularly as we're looking at, our sunflowers and different things. That's pretty good. Okay. We also have longhorn bees. These tend to come out more mid to late summer. They really like sunflowers. And they're called longhorn bees because the males in particular have these incredibly long antennae. They are very charming. Sometimes this bee here is actually biting onto the flower. It's a male bee sleeping overnight in the sunflowers. So keep your eye, if you grow sunflowers, especially as the summer goes on, look in those flowers at dusk, because I almost can guarantee you that you'll have male bees nesting in the flowers. And if you feel confident, you can grab them because the male bees don't sting. That's another story, which we probably don't have time to go into, but they're pretty great. Those antennae are very charming. And then we have our mining bees. So these actually come out in the springtime. And as soon as things warm up there and you get some nice 70-degree days with sun, these bees start coming out. Here, where I look across from where my office is my living room right now. So I stare across at the street, a school across the street, where we've got these tickle bees, as we call them. This is what I'm looking at right now. And every year in the springtime, this started now 2 weeks ago, we start to see these little mounds start to stick up, like thousands of them across this 2-acre field next to the Saban Elementary School. And if you look close, there's a little pile of debris. And then if you look really close on a sunny day, you see these cute little bees flying in and out. And the kids love them. They like grab them, they throw them at each other. The kindergartners are constantly making tickle bee hospitals. And the third graders every year have to teach the kindergartners that no, we don't, because you need to put bees in the hospital, which means pulling their wings or smushing them a little bit. It's like the third graders get very irate about the kindergartners harassing the bees. So there's this education every year back and forth. I mean, the kids get totally into it. And it's like the whole mascot for the school. And, it's like home of the tickle bees. I mean, it's pretty sweet. And they're called tickle bees because they don't sting, which is very convenient. Otherwise, it'd probably be a different story since there are several hundred kids going to school and running around where these bees are. Anyway, they're pretty fun. And so this is a classic example of a ground nesting solitary bee, in this case, though, where there are tens of thousands nesting in just 1 2-acre field. So it's pretty fun. Okay, those are our ground nesting bees, solitary. Now we switch to our tunnel nesting solitary bees. The life cycle is basically the same, but in this case, instead of nesting underground, these are the bees that are going to nest in tunnels. So it's roughly 30% of our native species. They like a hollow or a pithy stem, plant stem, old beetle borer tunnels, in wood, man-made cavities like the ground on your outdoor plug outlet outside if you leave it open. In some cases, even old snail shells, just all sorts of places these bees will go in and build a nest. And if we look at it, in the case of this mason bee here you've got this tunnel that's 5/16 of an inch wide, and they separate. Here's that ball of pollen and nectar that I talked about as in the ground nesting bee with the egg on it. But now we're separating these with mud in the case of the mason bee. As I'll talk about shortly, leaf pieces in the case of leaf cutter bees. Resin bees will use resin, will produce like a little excretion, all those sorts of things. Oh, Brittany, it's a good question. Okay, I'll come back to that. Actually, I'm going to talk about it right now. So the question in the chat box is, what's my favorite thing to tell kiddos who are afraid of bees? Because this comes up across the street, all the time. They become like totally excited about the tickle bees, but you don't want to go grab, and I don't mind if they grab these bees because it's pretty fun. It's like getting over any fears, but you don't want to grab, you don't want to grab a bumblebee. You don't want to grab a honeybee or a wasp because they will potentially sting. And the thing I tell them is that what's really important is that most bees don't sting. They tend to only sting if you are at their nest. And that's in the case of social species like bumblebees or honeybees. Even though solitary bees, granted, those solitary bees can't sting. There are a few other species that aren't nesting out there that could, but even then, solitary bees just don't. It's not in it for them. And at flowers, no bees, no wasps sting at flowers unless they get under your shirt or unless you grab them or something like that. The most important thing is they're just doing their thing. And if you don't harass them and don't grab them, they pretty much leave you alone. Unless, of course, you step on a hornet's nest or you stand in front of a beehive. Yeah, when you're close to thousands of these bees in a place that's their home where they've stored all this food and have their babies, yeah, you want to give them some space. But when you're in a garden, they're harmless. You've got to really work to get stung. And so that's what I try to communicate is, if they've got something to protect, you want to give them some space. But if they're just out there visiting flowers, and even in the nests out here, they're wonderful little animals. So there you go. That's what I tell them. Anyway, so this is what the inside of that looks like. And I mentioned, in the case of the mason bee, they use mud. Leaf cutter bees are going to use leaf pieces. There are some bees that use sawdust, resins, plant fibers. I want to put a couple pictures here of redbud and cherry, just to show you it's kind of fun, especially if you work with gardeners or you're out in your own garden. Many plants, the different prunus species, redbud, some roses, snowberry, you may see pieces like cuts taken out of the edge of leaves like this. If you see a pattern where all of these cuts, are from the outside of the leaf like this, and you've got a mix of circles and ovals, you almost certainly have damage from leaf cutter bees because they're cutting from the edge of the leaf and they are cutting shapes that are going to fit different parts of the tunnel that they're working in. So, the circles are going to get stacked up on the end of the tunnel. The ovals are going to be used to kind of wrap the sides because they're basically making this like cool little capsule into which they're literally making like, I don't know, like a capsule into which they're putting that pollen and nectar. And it's pretty sweet to be walking around the neighborhood or even walking through nature and, you know, out in the woods where you've got trees like this, to be looking for these and all of a sudden be like, oh my God, check that out. And usually you'd see this more, say, midsummer to late summer. They tend to be a little later in the season, but it's pretty cool. And then you can impress whoever you're with. Be like, oh yeah, no, that's leafcutter bee damage. That's cool. That's not a caterpillar. But you have to look for that precision, like very nicely cut out circles, not just a like caterpillars, just whatever. Anyway, something to look for. So, and just some of the tunnel nesting bees, mason bees, a lot of people know about, you know, here's your classic blue orchard bee. So these are pretty common. A lot of people are managing these in their backyards for pollination. My favorite, if you haven't been able to tell so far, and I'm going to wax poetic a little bit more, are leafcutter bees. Because leafcutter bees have a lot of personality, so they're pretty fun. They collect their pollen on the bottom of their abdomen, which is pretty cool. You can see the pollen stacked in here. This is a really nice picture, I think, showing that. They just have a lot of attitude that just, I don't know, when you mess around with them at a flower, they will sting you if you harass them, like from personal experience. Like if you're poking or grabbing at them, but man, they just stick their abdomen in the air like a scorpion. They just have a lot of attitude. They look really tough. Their heads are really big. Oops, let me go back. Their heads are super big. Their jaws, that's a pretty good one. That's pretty good. Their jaws are just really big for chewing on, cutting those leaf pieces out. Anyway, leafcutter bees are cool. Just going to put that out there. You also have tunnel nesting small carpenter bees. These are just tiny little things that tend to like pithy stems. I'm going to talk more about pithy stems later. And oh shoot, I forgot to look. You go, yeah, I don't know if I should know. I'm the bee specialist, but large carpenter bees, you probably have actually eastern large carpenter bees coming as far as Montana, which look like big bumblebees and dig out nest tunnels. I left those slides out of this one. I'm noticing because we don't really have them in Washington where the last time I gave this talk. So anyway, probably have some big carpenter bees out there too, which are cool. All right, last group. So we've got ground nesting solitary, tunnel nesting solitary, and now we've got our social bumblebees. So these are kind of our most classic social bees. There are about 57 species in North America. This is the social colony founded by a single queen. She's going to do this every year. The colonies only last for a season, unlike honeybees. And those nests may have 100 to 300, maybe more workers, depending on the species. And their life cycle is a little bit different. The queens are overwintering right now, or just starting to come out on warm days. She by herself is going to find some sort of a little cavity, you know, maybe it's like a size of a softball or two, where she's going to start her nest, put these little wax pots into which she'll fill nectar and pollen, lay a bunch of eggs, get her first brood of workers out. And then once they're out, she's going to stay in the nest and let them forage, let them do all the dangerous work. Yeah, while she stays back inside, that colony grows through the season. And then, pardon me, at the end of the summer, they'll start producing male bees and new queens that will go out, leave the nest, mate. The male bees eventually die. You might see them on your sunflowers in the fall, late fall. And the queens now go find a place to overwinter. And we'll talk a little bit more about that overwintering here shortly, maybe. So the kind of places where those bees are going to build nests are abandoned rodent burrows, kind of areas of fallen over lodged grasses, thick thatch, rock piles, brush piles, you know, in some cases even birdhouses that have been used already. Any place you've got some of these different cavities, and different species like to be underground or under veg, kind of varies quite a bit depending on the species, but they're looking really for that little cavity to move into. And they'll insulate it and kind of make a little dome over it to keep it nice and warm and dry. And it'll look more or less like this by the time it gets to be mid-season. Lots of these little pots spread around. So they also need these overwintering sites. And so this is the place where that queen bee who's mated and ready to hang, like ready to come out again in the spring, she needs to find a protected place to spend the winter. Ideally, it's some sort of deep leaf litter, evergreen needle litter, maybe getting into the humus on the edge of like the thick humus that should be there. Ideally is there if it weren't for invasive earthworms around our forests. That's another story. That thick grass thatch, wood or rock piles. these sorts of places that are going to be a little bit protected from the elements, drier, warmer, and yeah, where they can kind of hunker down and try to spend the winter and be protected. So we need nest sites for bumblebees through the growing season, and then these sorts of places for the queens to get into to overwinter. And just a couple pictures of bumblebees so you can see them. Here's one, kissing a flower, a tomato flower. They do this thing called buzz pollination, where they'll, in this case, bite onto the anthers of a tomato and then vibrate their flight muscles to get the pollen to shoot out. And you can actually look at your tomatoes afterwards and see little bee kisses on them where the anthers are damaged by the bees biting. So this one here hasn't yet been bit. I should put a picture of one that's been, but you can imagine where it's biting on here. Yeah, you'll see little bite marks. I don't know, something to look for in your tomatoes this year. So just, some other bumblebees. Okay, cool. Those are our bees. So that's what we're thinking about, right? Like when I go to someone's farm or their garden and I'm helping them sort of read the landscape, I'm looking for, from a nest site perspective, where we might find ground nests, where we might see places for tunnel nesting, where there might be places for bumblebees to overwinter or to set up their nests. Those are the sorts of things I'm looking at, and then counting on the fact that we've got that range of resources that we will have pollinators show up. So again, if we're trying to think about that, like I just kind of did a recap on sort of the shelter part, but obviously if we're working to bring this habitat and conserve pollinators, we've got to have food and, nectar, pollen, host plants, the shelter I just was going back over, and then protection from that pesticide exposure risk, or even, protection from excessive disturbance, whether that's mowing or tilling or fire. A little disturbance is often very important, or managed disturbance in the landscape is important, but the scale of that disturbance is important too, because as we have smaller habitats, we have to worry about having disturbance across the whole habitat and potentially losing species. So anyway, I want to walk through each of these real quick. So it's important, as you saw from those bees, some are coming out in the spring, some are coming out in the summer, some are active like the bumblebees all year long. Ideally, when we're thinking about creating habitat, we've got that bloom from late winter all the way through late fall. So willows and lupins and spirea, here's pearly everlasting, but there's a whole suite, milkweed, all sorts of different species. Native thistles are phenomenal. It's too bad Canada thistle and bull thistle and these different things give the thistles a bad name, because the native thistles are some of the best pollinator plants out there. But asters, this is beggar's tick, but goldenrod, sunflowers, there are a whole suite of these different native plant species that you could have in and around a garden or a habitat, providing forage all season long. And we tend to focus, when we're creating high quality habitat, we tend to focus on natives because their native plants tend to support higher diversity. However, that doesn't mean I'm not adverse to some fine, echinacea or lavender or cosmos or sedum. There are a lot of garden plants, Russian sage, why not? If you're planting around your house, you want something pretty that's foolproof. There are a lot of plants out there that are garden plants that are just great pollinator plants, and they're beautiful. But if we're creating like a native natural habitat, we're really trying to maximize diversity. We go for the natives. The other thing that a lot of people think about is also thinking the next step would be thinking about host plants for butterflies. The milkweed, and thinking about monarchs, of course, is a pretty classic one. There are all sorts of, many of our native plants tend to be host plants for butterflies and moths. So it's important to think about that and have those in the landscape. But one thing people don't know a lot about is kind of what I'm now taking to like the 2.0 level, is that a lot of our native bee species are actually pollen specialists, which means they only collect pollen from a single species, a single genus, or maybe a family of plants. So when we do things like have willows in the landscape here, or sunflowers, there are in some cases dozens, if not hundreds of bees that will only forage on sunflower or only forage on willow. Those are a couple that stand out. Vaccinium, blueberries, huckleberries, they have a number of pollen specialists. Thinking of, say, what might be, in a place like Montana, the native thistles have a lot of pollen specialists. Many genera in the Asteraceae, like sunflowers, have pollen specialists. So it's really helpful to think about that. And we're trying to help people do that more and more. To that effect, we're actually in the process of updating all of our plant lists to include more information on butterfly host plants and species that have got that high pollinator value, including supporting specialist bees. So that's something that's coming to our website, hopefully in the next couple of months. All right, let's see here. Nesting habitat, I've talked about that. I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. You know, the grass, the mulch, these different places to overwinter and to nest in the case of bumblebees. You can really actively manage tunnel nests, in this case here for mason bees, in this case up here for leaf cutters. But when you're managing these nests and you're actually, you know, putting out maybe dozens or hundreds of tunnels, there are a lot of pests and diseases. Last year I had the Houdini flies come and just take out almost all of my blue orchard bees. So you need to ideally learn how to manage those nests to deal with pests and diseases. And we worked with the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program at USDA to come out with what I think is some of the best guidelines on that. But I'm not going to go into details on that now. It's just something that's worth knowing about. We tend these days for gardeners, you could either encourage people to put out a few tunnels, a few nests, or to grow plants, shrubs in particular. Well, I'll come to other stems in a second, that have got pithy stems where you might actually have bees move in. So elderberry, caneberries, wild rose, ninebark to a certain degree, lilac even. You know, if you cut off these stems, you've got these pithy centers that bees are going to move into quite frequently, actually. But increasingly too, if you've got wildflowers that have really stiff upright stems that tend to persist in the wintertime, if you cut those off, you're able to actually also have bees nesting in those. A lot of those tiny small carpenter bees really like to move into the stems of aster, goldenrod, echinacea, monarda. And so if you kind of leave those stalks intact into the winter, and then the toughest ones kind of late winter start to prune them back so that they are 8 inches to 24 inches long, and let then the plant grow up back around them the next year, you can still try to keep it tidy, because I like to keep it tidy. But you know, instead of cutting things to the ground, cut them off at like 1 foot to 2 feet and consistent. And you may have bees then come in and actually nest inside of those stems the next year. I don't know, it's something fun to play with, and I'll get small carpenter bees and other things coming into the nests on my property. And then winter cover, a lot of the pollinators that are out there, like different caterpillars, are going to want to crawl into piles of leaves and organic debris. So increasingly, Xerces is helping people think about, hey, if you've got leaf litter out there, instead of just getting rid of all of it, piling it up in different places, using it as thick mulch, you know, getting it so you're maybe not smothering your lawn, if you like, you know, but getting it to where you've got bees and butterflies and moths, you could get them, you know, helping them by nesting in that habitat. I don't know, just something to think about as you're managing, let's say, leaf litter, other organic litter around trees and around the yard. One thing that's interesting to me, there's been a recent movement in some places around what's called creating soft landings. A lot of our trees have all sorts of butterflies and moths that are going to feed on those, or maybe come to ground to overwinter, or come to ground to pupate. And so having in the area below those at the base, that big thick mulch that, you know, insects can get into overwinter, like I said, or pupate, it's just kind of I don't know, increasingly it's good for the tree. It's also just a good place to have more habitat. All right, got to protect that habitat from insecticide exposure. That's pretty important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But you know, when it comes to pesticides, we really recommend minimizing or not using them, reading their guidance carefully, and being cautious that even if the label says, here's how to use it in a way that's protective, it's not always protective, certainly for butterflies and moths, much less for native bees. Those protections are generally geared towards honeybees. So a step, but not necessarily taking you all the way. One thing that's important, and I'll put these slides up. I'll get these slides to Jillian and Sydney afterwards. But we've got on our website new guidance on how to buy bee safe plants, because a lot of the plants we buy, we actually are in the middle of 2 studies that we're working on. Pretty much every plant we buy from a nursery is contaminated with pesticides, almost universally. And you know, partially it's fungicides, many of which are bee toxic to keep the plants healthy from disease. In most cases, though, it's insecticides. And in almost half the cases, they were at levels that could pose a risk to bees. And so we're giving people tools, developing tools to help people ask questions at their nurseries to help them buy bee safe, or at least bee safer plants. Not to mention working with the nurseries to help them understand maybe some strategies that can reduce the potential risk, or how to reduce the risk of any pesticide use that they're doing. In some cases, these are systemics that are actually taken up into the plant and come out in the pollen and nectar. In some cases, it's on the surface of the leaves or the flowers. Just it's good to know about. It's a little disheartening, but I think we can be taking some action to help. I also want to say, when we're creating this habitat, when we're thinking about a garden or a farm, the good pollinator habitat is also supporting all these other beneficial insects like syrphid flies and minute pirate bugs and lady beetles and wasps, parasitoid wasps that attack these aphids, lacewings, just a whole suite of insects that are really important to that feed on garden pests and crop pests and can be part of your pest control at home. All right, we're on the home stretch because it's almost time to finish the bee's knees and see where we go. So to wrap up, and then we'll do some Q&A here, that means to help people implement and do all this, like I said, we put together a lot of resources. One thing that's been fun is we've recently, make sure I've got it. Yeah, we recently put together a habitat assessment guide for yards, gardens, and parks to help people think about and read their own landscape. We've done similar tools for farms and natural areas and rangelands and things like that. And the goal here is to help you, and I'm going to zoom in, kind of help you think through in a sort of a step-by-step process, with the foraging habitat you have, the nesting habitat, pesticide practices, and really also encourage community action, putting up a sign, telling people about what you've got. So I can actually, even when we're done here, I can put a link to this because it's a pretty fun document that in a way summarizes all the habitat elements I just talked about. Lots of books. We've produced a lot of books about pollinator conservation, beneficial insects that are available, from your local bookstore. Highly recommend. It's a great place to get them these days. And just all sorts of downloadable plant lists, conservation guides for roadsides, backyards, bumblebees, milkweed. I mean, just a whole slew of stuff. It's a little overwhelming, the number of materials we've got out there, but we've tried to organize it by region so you could go to our resource center, the Pollinator Resource Center, and try to see for your area, what are the plant lists that we know of, what are the conservation guides we know of, nest construction guides, identification guides, pesticide guides, a native plant nursery directory. We've tried to kind of organize this by pretty broad region just to make it a little more manageable for us. Just to help try to get you to resources. So this is a great place to go to try to find things that might be helpful. I will say that we are a donor-supported organization. It's a soft ask, but if you're interested in learning more, you can go to the xerces.org website to see what we've got going on. And all of those donations help match all the funds that I raise, from the federal government. We need to match all of that work one-to-one. So and you get our magazine, Wings, you get access to all sorts of great resources. Actually, you already have access to all the great resources. Just something to think about. It's a soft ask. And that's it. Just to kind of wrap things up, I think one really important thing is that everybody, because of the size of bees and pollinators and pollinator habitat, everybody can do something to help bees and all these other pollinators. And this, what I like to think of as the miniature wildlife in the garden. Even a small planting, you can go out there if you choose the right plants. And it's in a nice spot. You can go out there in the middle of summer and you'll see all sorts of amazing bees. To me, it takes what is just gardening and beautiful flowers to like this whole next level, which I think is pretty fun. It's so, I don't know, it just makes walking outside into the front yard or the backyard feel just that much more alive. So I don't know, to me, it's pretty exciting work. I like it because you can do something, everybody can do something, even if it's just putting a sunflower on a patio and you'll see some fun bees. All right, there you go. We're going to call that good for right now. And I'm going to have a sip of my bee's knees.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. I personally was taking a lot of little notes, even though I helped put this webinar together. Wanted to give a little quick outro, and then we can leave all the extra time for questions. And I personally, as well as mates, I mean, mates, you can decide to stay on as long as you want, but I'll keep the Zoom open and stop the recording at any point. But that was our first session for the Cocktails and Conservation. We do have another one coming on May 18th. It is about food waste. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one enough that you'll want to come back. We'll be sending out another link and you're already registered, so no need to worry about that. I recognize a lot of you from the Pollinator Initiative that we host at the Gallatin Conservation District. If you're unfamiliar, I'll leave a link in the chat for you to learn a little bit more about the program. You can get some free seed. And I mean, why would you not want to promote pollinators after that great presentation? So yeah, I'll keep it brief there and we can field some questions. I know there's already some in the chat. And yeah, thank you guys so much for coming, especially those in Bozeman. And it's very nice outside and we very much appreciate you coming in on Zoom and learning about the pollinators. But we have a couple more hours of sunlight. So after we wrap up, you can head outside and start planning where you want to put your pollinator plots. So, all right, Mace, I gave you about 30 seconds to take a breath and you can maybe answer some of the questions that we have.
Yeah. Oh, you bet. And I gotta admit, I got a soft spot for Bozeman. You all live in that is a beautiful city. That is a beautiful area. That's all I gotta say. Okay, let's see here. Hallie was asked, how long in the season, what temperature is it safe to start clearing out that mulch and ground cover where bees and other winterers might be? You know, it's a tricky one. I do think when I think about it, I tend to wait until, like, as I look out at where I've done this in my front yard, kind of convenient. I tend to, if I'm going to clear out mulch and maybe, tidy things up, for example, I probably would wait until at least mid-spring, as where spring is really kicked into gear. There's always going to be the risk that there's critters in there, but it's really that overwintering through the heart of winter. So from my opinion, overall, if you then wanted to come back and then sort of move mulch around or, kind of do some more garden management, I'd probably wait until at least mid-spring before doing anything major, which is why it's probably worth thinking ahead. If you've got a garden where you want to get in there really early, as soon as you can in the spring, this is not something necessarily to, I take that back. If you want to get, I'm going to come back to this idea. If you want to get in there and dig up a garden bed, for example, maybe earlier than that, I do think if you wanted to put a mulch on a bed, even one that you're going to manage early in the spring, I think it's fine personally to rake stuff off if it's not going to go in the compost bin and get taken away, to keep a bed over covered. Oh God, sorry, I'm thinking out loud and that's always a problem. I don't know. If you want to avoid damaging like what might be in there, probably wait till mid-spring. However, personally, if I, for example, took a bunch of leaves and put them on a garden bed that's kind of disconnected maybe from trees and shrubs and more wildlife habitat where insects may sort of drop into it, I feel like there's just going to be less stuff that's in there. And you're kind of working on the health of a garden bed, and I don't mind in that case, turning those leaves in if that's something that you would do, for example. I think that's fine. I think the better habitat value when it comes to leaf litter is when it is under, say, shrubs and wildflower plantings and edge plantings. If you've got a full-on vegetable bed that you put a bunch of leaf mulch on, yeah, you might, damage some critters. But I think overall, I don't see that as a huge problem. So I like the idea of having that sort of soft landing zone under those trees and shrubs. That's where I think you're getting the biggest ecological benefit from that leaf litter myself. And so I think if you think about the different places in the landscape, I'm less concerned about the timing, let's say, of disturbing that leaf litter if it's in the middle of a vegetable bed than if it's like, ooh, really purposeful long-term underneath trees and shrubs, if that makes sense. Let's see here. Cindy asked about bug zappers bad for bees. No, but they're bad for pretty much everything else. Bug zappers. Ah, man, I grew up loving those things. Midwest, the big giant mayflies, and would hit them and they'd explode. And as a little kid, I was like, oh, that's cool. I don't think bug zappers in general tend not to do a great job at killing mosquitoes, which is what we're really most concerned about. And they tend to be really good at attracting a lot of those, I think, really interesting, well, some of the crane flies, I guess, can be yard pests, but a lot of the different big flies, moths that are going to come in. I think bug zappers are probably, they're just not they don't get at what we want them to really get at, to kill in a significant way. So no, they're not bad for bees, but I think there are a lot of other valuable insects that are really important food for bats, for birds, that probably are going to get killed orders of magnitude more than any mosquitoes that are going to really get in there. So I think when it comes, because that's the main reason to have a bug zapper. And I think if you're going to invest in something like that, some of the newer technologies, traps that put out carbon dioxide to kind of really specifically attract mosquitoes, for example, those sorts of things are more effective. Let's see, Jillian's got the link, awesome, to the Gallatin Pollinator Initiative. I think that is great. And definitely follow up with her to get more local help and support. I think that is very cool. NRCS in Bozeman has had me out, it's been a couple of years, but a couple times to do trainings for their staff and work with Pheasants Forever staff and other folks there. And oh my goodness, you got an amazing lab. Actually, you've got amazing people at Montana State doing bee research right now. Like really, truly some amazing folks there. Yeah, that are like some of the best in the country. So you've got great pollinator support. In fact, really great demonstration gardens right over there at MSU around pollinator habitat. Like, oh, there are some really just amazing people that are doing pollinator work right in your backyard. Yeah, some amazing people. Let's see, Susie writes, if I bundle up dead, oh, I like where this is going. If I bundle up dead raspberry or flower stalks for bee habitat, where should they be placed? Great question. In fact, I just hired somebody who just did a bunch of research on this. So definitely a sunny spot, but it doesn't matter if it's low to the ground, high to the ground. I think put it someplace that is probably fun and easy to watch, where it gets, for sure, good sun early in the day, and to the middle part of the day. We used to say that, oh, it's probably good if it gets late afternoon sun just to keep it from baking too much. So I still kind of ascribe to that, just in case you have a really hot day and the sun is on it at the hottest part of the day. I think that early morning sunshine through the middle part of the day is good, because it warms them up, helps them get out there, stay drier. I think that would be great. And I'm actually kind of a big fan of bundling up small numbers of dead raspberry or flower stalks, and letting them degrade. They tend to work pretty well for a year or so. And if you've got small bundles of, let's say, I don't know, 6 to 12, you'll still get some bees coming into those, but then they'll break down and you don't have like dozens of these tunnels all in one place, where something like a Houdini fly or a parasitic wasp can go through and lay lots of eggs very efficiently. Sort of spread them out around the garden is what I'm saying. Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. That's very nice. Excellent. Cool. Thanks, Valerie. Love it. This is great. You all are in a blessed place. Like, definitely explore what's available from the folks at Montana State at MSU too. Just because I do think you've got some great folks. Diane Dubinsky is an old friend, and she's an amazing researcher on butterflies, who's now based there in the last, well, it's been a long time now. And not to mention the honeybee folks that are up there, and there are some great native bee folks. You got some great people that are doing work. So yeah, maybe we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm gonna end the recording here. You can find this lovely presentation if once wasn't enough. We're gonna try and post it on our YouTube page, especially for those who were unable to make it live today. So once again, we have the next webinar coming up next month, May 18th. So hoping to see a bunch of you there. Thank you so much, Mace. We'll be in touch soon.
All right. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate all the work you're doing.